Linda, thank you for joining us this morning. I know that this is going to be a tremendous conversation, and we've got a lot of eager folks here ready to learn. So again, thank you for taking some time with us. I'm going to jump right in to kind of your path, right? So your father was an immigrant from Germany.
Yes.
Mother was a fellow Detroiter. I'm a Detroiter, so a fellow Detroiter. Came together, and Linda came. And I know in the early days of your upbringing, you never really thought about yourself as a businesswoman. But your dad really had an intense focus, I think, on you. Talk a little bit about how that sort of still comes about in your day-to-day.
Well, my father wasn't just German, he was Prussian. And he had two defining things in his life that he taught me. Two, he said, if you can't remember anything else, you must remember these two things. You will remember these two things. Number one, good enough is never good enough. Okay. And number two, leave things better than you found them. So on those two defining principles, I adored my father. He was 20 years older than my mother, so my mother was a, young, beautiful woman from Little Italy, Detroit, mm-hmm. And he had been, an aristocrat in Germany, and he was the smartest in the family, so they sent him to be educated in the U.S. He wanted to go to the University of Michigan Medical School, but his aunt told him that there was this new industry coming out called the automotive industry, and that he should get with the program and get with the new industry. So he became an automotive engineer and ended up having 19 U.S. patents in automotive engineering. I worked for Chrysler Corporation all those years, started at Briggs, which became Chrysler. So unlike some of your prior speakers, I did not come from an unsuccessful family. We were a nice upper middle class family. I grew up in Grosse Pointe and Bloomfield Hills. I grew up around CEOs. I grew up around wealthy, important people. And I took every lesson that my mother could find, swimming lessons and singing lessons and every lesson. And I had what I thought was a real normal childhood, except what I didn't know that I had was the disease to please. And that disease caused me to make some really bad mistakes in my 20s. But in my youth, while other people were, little girls were playing with dolls or whatever, my father had an office in our home, where he would draw his patents. And he would have business cards that he'd throw in the trash, people he had met. Mm-hmm. And I would sneak and take those out. And I had my little office, and I wanted to model myself after him and be a business person. My mother, on the other hand, who was one of 10 children, the 5 boys all went to college, the 5 girls did not, said, honey, just go to school, go to college, get your degree, teach school for 3 years, bring out the best in those little kids, then have your own little kids, marry a really rich guy, and, life will be good. And I did.
And you did. And so then you graduated from college, came here to GW, got your master's degree.
No.
No?
Mm-mm.
I'm wrong about that? Okay, tell me what happened.
The only time I called my father at work. Now, don't your children call you all the time? Well, back then you didn't do that. The only time I called my father at work was to tell him that I had been accepted on early admissions to the University of Michigan, the school he came to the U.S. to apply to. I was now going to. Actually, he told me that the only place I could go was the University of Michigan. So I was just reaffirming what he had wanted. I actually wanted to come east to go to college, but that wasn't happening.
That wasn't happening. More of that disease to please, which I think we're probably going to touch on a little bit more later on.
So I came to graduate school. I came to Washington and thought that I would, as a child of the 60s, I wanted to change the world. And so I tried to get a job on Capitol Hill, and I realized the first thing about the world, you've got to know someone. And I didn't know anyone. So I couldn't get a teaching job. So I went to graduate school at GW, got my master's degree in adolescent development. As it turns out, that is a lesson in life.
Okay.
So if you go on a job site, there are a lot of adolescents.
Got it. So you got here, began to teach at some stage.
After graduate school, I did finally get a teaching job because in one of my graduate classes, there was a principal from Fairfax County, and he helped get me through the system. I taught school at Luther Jackson Intermediate, which is at Route 50 and Gallows Road, and the area was growing, and so I taught in a World War II Quonset hut at the bottom of the hill. I didn't teach in the big girls' building. I taught in this little Quonset hut, and realized that, 8th grade girls and boys just didn't care about the Gettysburg Address. And I was heartbroken that no one actually cared about history and English. They really didn't care about. Shakespeare, who, what, who's he?
So then, again, following kind of the idyllic path that your mom laid out for you, then you got married to a very successful person.
I got married to a doctor, and lived in a 9,000-foot home that we built together overlooking the Potomac in McLean. I had a nanny for my 2 near-perfect children, a housekeeper, a gardener, a nice big Cadillac, great jewelry. But what no one knew behind that, those walls, was that I was actually an abused wife and married to a very sick man who could only stay up. In those days it was called manic depression, who could only stay up by self-medicating, and as a doctor he could get any drugs he wanted, and would use amphetamines, also known as speed, to keep himself up. And his condition got worse and worse and worse. And first it was emotional abuse, but then when he threw a vacuum cleaner at me, I figured it was about time to take action. He was very controlling. I had no car in my name. I was given a allowance for groceries, but I used to just hide some. So I did have $5,000 in cash in a kettle. My Italian grandmother would have been so happy about that. And I went to an attorney and went to an attorney. He got a private investigator to help me, and I was on my way to getting a divorce, which was a brutal and cruel process. At the time, in the 70s, I was nothing, remember, I wasn't a school teacher, I was a stay-at-home mom. I was asked what I did to provoke this very great doctor who was saving lives. So that was kind of a defining moment, I have to say.
And so really, maybe among the first moments that, you began again, right? And so I think, one of the things I think just about every leader knows is there's moments where, you can either go left or you can go right, and you keep going right. So what was it in that moment that just sort of got you to go where you knew you needed to be?
On the day of my father's funeral, I was evicted from this big house, and I had to ask my next door neighbor to take in my children until I could get back to Washington. So the last remembrance I have of my father was holding a picture to his heart of my 3-year-old and 2-year-old. And if nothing else ever motivated you in the world, seeing the man that you loved, dying and holding a picture of your children, because it was the bottom of my life. I couldn't imagine life would get any worse. I had no money, I had no friends, because when you're sick, you have to control the person that you're living with, because you can't let that person out to know, you can't let anybody know how sick you are. So I really had nothing. And I moved in with a girlfriend, and I did have one friend. Her husband was a doctor, and started over. So I'd lost my teaching certificate, because you have to we have to reapply. So I lost my teaching certificate, and I went to an employment agency in Georgetown, and they said, "You've got no skills. You can, but we can get you a job as a receptionist for $12,000 a year." And I was trying to do the calculation of how I was going to feed 2 kids on $12,000 a year. As it turns out, a man, my kids were in a school, and in a little nursery school, and one of the men was the partner at what was then called Pete Marwick Mitchell and Co., now called KPMG. And I said I needed a job, and he said, "I think I can get you a job." It was in a recession, and they didn't want to, pay somebody to find these secretaries. So he got me a job at KPMG working for 2 consulting partners. As it turns out, one was German and one was Italian. So I just kept having this in my life. I say to people now, do you want the German to come out or the Italian? Because I can do both. And so I started at $16,000 a year working for these 2 consultants, and the managing partner was looking for an executive assistant and and wanted to hire from within. That man is in this room right this minute, Steve Harlan, who was actually one of the founders of Leadership Greater Washington. And I remember interviewing with him. In those days, you called him Mr. Harlan. And he said, well, you have really impressive credentials. Now, I was interviewing to be a secretary, which I actually knew nothing about, except that I could type. I had taken typing. And I said, "Yes, sir. Well, what might those be?" And he said, "Well, you've gone to 2 really good schools, and that's really impressive that you have these degrees." He said, "Do you take dictation?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't, but I have an English degree. So you just tell me what you want the letter to say, and I'll write it for you." At that moment, he hired me to be his executive assistant. That was in 1981. But my first day at KPMG, the secretary next to me said, "With all your fancy degrees, I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to do anything to help you. So just know that not to come to me for any help." I walked out the door that night, February the 1st, 1981, February the 2nd, 1981. I'd never taken a bus before, and it was snowing, and I was at 20th and K Street, and I said, I was crying because I couldn't figure out, I thought the bus would say Tyson's, or I don't know, I was all confused, and these buses kept going by, and it was snowing, and I remember finally getting on a bus to go back to Tyson's, to my little apartment, and I remember saying to myself, "Okay, universe, you've given me about as much as I can take, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure that other people don't have to go through this." Coming from such a proud family to feeling so alone was motivating.
Mm-hmm. I got it. So KPMG, there's a start, right? Fast forward a little bit, there's some marketing, right?
Well, he promoted me 3 months after being his assistant to the head of practice development, which was a marketing position. The largest offices were asked to have this new thing in accounting called marketing. And I remember Steve took me to Dominique's restaurant and said, "I'm going to promote you." And I said, "Sir, you don't understand. I don't know anything about marketing." And he said, "Well, learn. And by the end, I want you to be the best in the business. I want you to be #1 in all of Pete Marwick." So just before I left, my shining moment at that, well, I got to meet lots of people in that position. And Steve was polite enough to have me really begin having a Rolodex of friends. The last thing I did before I left was I went to the Washington Business Journal and said, you have a list of public companies, but you don't have a list of privately held companies. And if you will create that list, we will have a lunch and have some big name speaker come speak. Every year since then, the Washington Business Journal has done the list of privately held companies, which I am now on, ironically. And so to show you how desperate I was to please the second father in my life, Steve Harlan, I first tried to get Lee Iacocca because of my connections back to Chrysler. He said no. Then I tried to get Peter Uberoff, and he said no. But I did get T. Boone Pickens. And he came to Washington, and people came out for that luncheon, and I was really proud of that. I was really, when you start to feel like you're making a difference, like you're getting somewhere, it feeds on itself. And of course, when you're in a really deep hole, every little inch up, I used to say inch by inch is a cinch, yard by yard is hard. So every inch meant something. And then one day, I walked into Mr. Harlan's office. By the way, I made his coffee every morning. I walked into his office and said, "Sir, I don't want to be an accountant. I'm now making $50,000 a year. This has been a wonderful thing, but I've got to have my own corner office. And a woman I know has offered to make me a partner in the first woman-owned construction company in Washington." And he heard me out, and he said, well, I would like you to walk around the office and find something that we need to renovate because I want to be your first client. Wow. Now that is leadership, sponsorship, mentorship, and it changed the trajectory of my life. Thank you, Steve.
So we're going to give him...
By the way, I didn't know he was going to be here today. He surprised me.
Leadership Greater Washington has a way of doing that to us. So taking the easy way, of course, you then jump into construction and real estate, probably one of the toughest industries on the planet.
So the less you know about an opportunity, the better it looks. Knowing nothing about construction, my new partner had been doing marketing for a design firm. Mm-hmm. And here's how I looked at it. I'm a really good cook. So I can read a recipe and tweak it and understand what goes with what. Drawings are just a recipe for building something. So in my head, I said, okay, I think I can do this. I call him my current husband, but we've been married a really long time, said to me, you think you have to be Lee Iacocca because you think you have to be your father because your father was so technical. You don't have to be your father. You have to be Lee Iacocca. Just go sell work. And that stuck in my head, like, wow, that, I don't have to go back and learn things that I don't know. By the way, I have never had a single business class, ever. And I'm not proud of that. I just never had time to get a degree in business. So with with a new partner, of course, I knew nothing about business. We started the first woman-owned construction company. Now, as it turns out, she had the right to 3 directors. I had the right to 2. And she had 520 shares of voting stock. I had 490. But we each had 10,000 shares of non-voting stock. So we got to take out the same amount of money. She just had all the power. I thought, what can $20 or $30 mean? Well, it meant that she could fire me, which she did in my year in Leadership Washington. I was the 3rd class, boring but bonded.
Great name.
I gave the 20-year anniversary at my house. I gave the 30-year anniversary just recently at my home in Bethesda. And we are still boring but bonded.
That's wonderful. Well, that's a wonderful story, but I think it's going to lead you to talk a little bit about the Michelle Hagan story, which I just heard about a little bit here, which I'll continue the theme of another moment that takes you on to the next moment.
So I was literally walked out of the company that I had founded by an armed security guard. And, you know, at 5'1", I looked really like I was going to punch. What was I going to do? But it was an armed security guard. And the next morning, I called Steve, who was then the vice chairman international of KPMG, and said to his assistant, I really need to talk to, I was now calling him Steve. I really need to talk to Steve. And she said, well, he's in China. I said, okay, now we know the location. Let's figure out the time. And it was, I don't know, 3 o'clock in the morning, Steve. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, his time, and he called and said, I told him the story, and he said, first, you need to get a good lawyer, and I'll get you a good lawyer. And second of all, you need to promise me that you will take the highest road possible. Take the high road. It's less traveled, but a better road. So I did that, and she had to pay for my stock. She could fire me, but she had to pay me for my stock. Now, at the time, we were a $3 million company, which in construction terms is like 50 cents. A $3 million company a construction company is not a big company, but I was making $150,000 a year, and that's what enticed me. She said, we will be making a 6-figure income within 3 years. Well, actually, we made it every year. She wanted my 6-figure income and her 6-figure income. She thought together that would be better music. So I took the summer off, and then with another young man from one of my competitors, started Rand Construction. His last name was Anderson. My last name was Rabbitt, and Rabbitt and Anderson became Rand. I learned my lesson. I owned 70% of the company. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. And we began Rand.
Got it. And so let me take a bit of a plateau here. So as I said earlier, oh, go ahead.
Michelle.
Oh, yeah.
So in the summer, I was taking the summer off, and I had grown very fond of a Leadership Washington person, a person I'd met through Leadership Washington, Michelle Hagan, who was in the real estate business. And she took me out to lunch that summer, and she said, well, what did you do, and what did your partner do? And, well, I did this and this and this, and what did she do? Not so much. I did this, this, and this. What did she do? Not so much. And she said, Linda, if you did all that, just get up on the horse you just fell off of and go start over again. Clearly, you know how to run a company. Clearly, you have the right connections. Clearly, you have good connections, because at the time, we were doing work for the Oliver Carr Company. Back then, that was a premier, they were a premier developer. So it was really through my Leadership Washington girlfriend that I got the courage, and she had the wisdom to give me permission to start over again.
So with that start, and again, I want to take a little plateau here, real estate. You happen to be a woman who is a leader in the real estate industry. Did that cause you to lead any differently, you think, than maybe some of your peers, competitors, those folks that happen to be men?
Yes.
Oh.
I had a very, very difficult time hiring people in the office that we in the industry call suits, right, Phyllis? The guys who were coming out of, great engineering schools, University of Maryland, Penn State, Virginia Tech, did not want to work for a girl who had an English and American history degree. However, the superintendents, the people in the field who actually ran the projects, flocked to me because they thought I would treat them better than they were being treated in their current companies. and to this day call me Mother Rabbitt.
Okay, got it.
So it was, in that regard, it was an advantage. I can assure you there were no other advantages in 1989. I looked up this morning that there were 5.193 billion people in the world in 1989. I think there's probably not one of them who walked the face of the earth that year who believed I could build a $350 million company.
And yet you did.
And yet I did.
And yet you did. In fact, you say, you've never sat through a business education class, but you have a Harvard Business Review case written about you. Now, it wasn't a particularly wonderful time. Again, maybe another point in time of not starting over, but definitely a point of inflection that you had to think about going forward. It was September 2014. Talk a little bit about that time.
So there was one kind of critical moment before then,
Okay.
and then I'll get to then. So I started at KPMG as 32 years old. By 52 years old, I thought, wow, the world has given me everything, and they've thrown the kitchen sink at me. There just can't possibly, I have overcome this and this and this and this. There just can't possibly be anything more I could have to overcome. When I got the diagnosis that I had breast cancer, and my husband said to me, you're sick, you're really sick. You can't run that company. And so for 9 months, I turned it over to a young man whose name is John Couch, who also went through Leadership Washington. And he was my legacy. He was going to take over the company. And in September of 2014, he died in a plane crash. So I had gone off and was sitting on corporate boards and was the chair of the Federal Reserve of Richmond and was doing exciting, interesting things. And now I was back doing two jobs, my job and his job. So that was a challenge. Just before then, a professor had called me and asked me if he could do a case study. And in typical, my daughter calls it the Imposter Syndrome. I believe that someday somebody's going to figure out that I just couldn't have possibly done all this. And he called and said, I want to write a case study. And I said, you write case studies about big deal people. Like, I don't have a story. Well, he convinced me to do it, and that was before John died. So when John died, the case study became a different case study. It became, okay, somebody has built up this business, and then the legacy plan fails. What's she going to do next? And when you sign up to do a case study, you also sign up to be the protagonist. So I now go to Harvard, and when he teaches this case, I get to stand up for the last half an hour and have people ask me questions. It's really quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's literally the pinnacle of business case review. So it was fascinating to kind of read through that and see the story play out. So your trajectory, your career as a leader, has been hallmarked by these sort of moments of either, if not the bottom, pretty close to the bottom in some cases, definitely points of inflection, but then coming out of the other side even stronger. Can you talk a little bit about what is it that makes you come out even stronger than before, getting back on that horse, but then taking that horse 10 times further than you had taken it before?
Steve used to cup his hand on his desk and say, Linda, you need clear, sharp focus. And so I had 2 children that I had to take care of, that I wanted to take care of, who I loved desperately. And I learned how to stretch myself. And it's scary to stretch yourself. I remember sitting next to Janet Yellen in the boardroom of the Federal Reserve downtown in a room that my company had done a historic renovation of. So I had been there first as a general contractor. Now I'm sitting next to Janet Yellen, and I'm thinking, oh God, please don't ask me an economic question, because I was asleep in Econ 101 my freshman year. But that took guts. It took courage to say yes to doing some of the things that I did. It took courage to walk into the Washington Building Congress or any of my industry associations. And back then, men were in baby blue leisure suits, I think they called them. They were just disgusting. They were and polyester, these things. And somebody would come up to me and say, so what do you do for Rand Construction? And I'd say, well, sir, I hope a lot, because, I own the place. And he would just walk away. People said some really crummy, unflattering things. And my biggest challenge was to lead a company and not be perceived in a very tough industry as a witch with a bee. That was my hardest challenge, because if you go too far this way, you're a witch with a bee. If you go too far this way, you're a powder puff. And finding that band, because guys have this band, but girls have this band, because it's unfeminine still in our society to be assertive, to be powerful, it's just unfeminine. And I'm not saying that it's better than it was 30 years ago. And in many ways, I used my EQ which women have a lot of, to propel me. But the thing that I really did was give myself the permission and the courage to be in places that I didn't actually really deep down, the little girl inside didn't believe she should be there. So I put on a really good front, and Lyle's car is also in the room, and Lyle's is a fabulous salesman, and I used to go to him and say, so Lyle's, I've got to do this pitch tomorrow, and somebody has, they're going to have this objection. What do I say? So I used my network to teach me how to do things that I didn't know how to do. And I decided that I had to build myself from inside out, that I had to have my own true north if I was going to lead anyone else to their true north. And that took a lot of courage, because, I was very insecure.
Got it. Last question before I turn it over to the audience. You talk a lot about the influences of your dad, but I think I know that one of your mom's influences was this notion of having little daily successes. Like you add up the little daily successes, and over time they add up to big successes. In this day and age, we're moving so fast. Like, information that was, really important to your life on Monday, by Thursday is ancient history. What would you suggest to these leaders about staying grounded and really getting into the weeds on having those daily successes?
You can't have any success unless you have a network of people who want you to be successful and who you want to be successful. So I look around at some people in my network who are in this room, and I work very hard at keeping connected with people. Not on Facebook, not Twitter, I don't do any of that, but one-on-one, personal connections. How long have you and I known each other? Right. So the success comes by every day connecting with someone, helping someone, finding the best in someone, because that finds the best in me. If I can find the best in you, that's the best of me coming out. I kind of got to this philosophy where you only keep what you give away. And if you give away your heart, your soul, your good advice, your whatever, you get to keep that. You get to keep the success of that. You get to keep the joy of that. And I don't mean that in a flowery sense. I mean that in a, how do you want to live your life sense? If you only go around once, at the end, when you look back, what do you want to be proud of?
Yeah. Thank you. All right, we're going to open it up. Questions? Right here in the front row.
Hi, Linda.
Got a microphone coming?
I'm a firm believer that as female CEOs and male CEOs, if we want to take care of our customers, vendors, and employees, we have to take care of ourselves. So can you talk a little bit about your self-care routine? For example, how many hours of sleep do you get? Do you exercise? Do you follow a nutrition plan? And how do you manage stress?
Well, I didn't get a mammogram for 3 years and ended up with breast cancer, so I would probably get an F in taking care of myself because I was, quote, too busy. But I do now make sure that I get 8 hours of sleep. I do try to eat well. I do exercise a little bit. I hate every minute of it, but I just hate it. So I put the news on, I listen to 60s music, I talk on the phone, and I just have to be distracted because I hate it so much, but I do try to do that. And what was the last part of your question?
How do you manage stress?
Oh.
Do you meditate or do yoga, or how do you manage stress?
So many of you know Bob Rosen, right? Healthy Companies. He wrote a book once about productive anxiety, and that's what I have, is productive anxiety. I have plenty of anxiety, I just use it productively. And what I do is make a list every Sunday of the things I need to accomplish that week, and have a red pen at my desk and cross out every single thing that I have accomplished. Because for me, accomplishment is a stress reducer.
That's great.
I also try to, before 10 o'clock every morning, do the thing I least want to do that day so that I can just get it off my plate and not have to worry about it all day.
Linda, Tony Cancelosi.
Hi, Tony.
How are you? I'm just overwhelmed by 2 comments that you made. Best in you and helping others. And that's fantastic. I think you ought to write a book. And I want to thank you. You renovated one of our buildings. Remember that? In Riverdale. And it was wonderful. But definitely, the things you're saying today are so impactful because if we don't think of others, no one will think of us. And so it's very, very important that you document this in a very special way. And I've written a book, but it's a children's book, but I'd be glad to help you. But I think it's wonderful that you do that because the other things you said, in order for you to be successful, you have to find other people to help you. And I think too often we ignore that. We always think we can do it on our own, but we can't. So thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Hi, Diana Mayhew. I've met one of your daughters, and so I'm just wanting to know how are your what are your kids doing? Are they influenced by your life story, and how have you inspired them? And how can we inspire our children?
So when people ask me the question, what are the best projects you've ever built? I say Ashley and Lauren Rabbitt. And I mean that very sincerely. So they were 3 and 2 when we left. Their father only saw them twice after that. And my eldest daughter, Ashley, went to Indiana University School of Music and then Eastman for her master's degree and was an opera singer for 10 years. Steve and Joanne went to most every opera she did around here. And she considers them her grandparents. She married an opera singer. They thought they could make a living but not a life. And so he went to Harvard Law School, and he's an attorney at Aiken Gump here in Washington. Ashley, my daughter, worked for CVS. Her big client was Aetna when they were doing things together. She became a management consultant. 2 very, very smart people, and who love each other and still love their love of opera and music, but are both very successful in their own rights. My youngest daughter, Lauren, is a real estate lawyer. She went to the University of Michigan and then GW Law School, my 2 schools. So that, I guess, is a little influence on my part. And she worked at Holland & Knight as a lawyer for 5 years and then was whisked away by a developer, roadside development, who, so she's in-house at Roadside, not as a lawyer, actually as a business partner. And she is now redeveloping the iconic Fannie Mae building on Wisconsin Avenue. Ashley has 3 sons. Lauren has 2 sons. I got no girls.
Candidate, do you have any advice for finding succession, figuring out a succession plan now that you've gone through it a couple times probably?
So I consider myself a professional service firm. You know, we're a management company. And so we're just like law firms or like accounting firms, and which is sort of how I knew how to do it after my 5 years of experience at KPMG. And so you generally want to hire from within, and you're grooming people, and I thought I was doing that. And it just so happened that my plan didn't work out. I had sat on the board of Watson Wyatt years ago with a professor from Harvard named Jack Gabbaro, who wrote all the original case studies about professional service firms. And when John died, I called him and said, okay, what do I do now? You know, my succession plan failed. And he said, it'll take you 3 or 4 years. It'll be really the hardest thing you've ever done, giving away your child. But you will be so proud when you succeed with it. And so it took me 5 years, because, I don't know, it took me 5 years. I've just named a new CEO of my company, comes from outside, very well liked, very well respected in the real estate industry, and I'm very proud of that. But you just have to, you know, it's a fly ball. You just have to take each day as it comes, process it, and figure it out. Because nothing is ever, there is no plan, no business plan, no life plan, no succession plan that ever goes the way it's written down, either in your head or on paper. The reason that successful people are successful, part of it is tenacity and all these different, you know, great adjectives. But part of it is the ability to redirect and readjust and take in information, figure it out, and redeploy your gifts in some new and some other way. And, you know, fortunately, so I don't know that I had that as a child, but I learned to have it because it was necessary for survival.
Hi, good morning. I'm Tisa Clark. I'm also a general contractor, but not as long as you have. And so my question is a two-parter. What would you tell your younger self with everything that you've learned as far as being in a male-dominated industry? And then to another general contractor who's kind of just getting started, 10 years, what advice would you give to them?
So the advice Steve would have given you that he gave me 34 years ago, was there are really only 2 kinds of people in the world: clients and potential clients. And so, you know, taking care of your reputation is really, 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 really important. And there were times that people said not nice things about me or my company, and I would try to politely overcome it, but they never took it that way. So somebody would say in a group meeting, well, I've never had a good experience with that company. So someone would tell me that. I'd call the person and say, gee, Joe, you know, refresh my memory. I hear you said you never had a good experience. I don't believe we've ever worked together at all. And he would years later say I yelled at him, because that's how he interpreted what I did. So there's a really fine balance of overcoming objections and protecting your reputation. And your reputation is everything. Construction is a long game. Clark Construction's over 100 years old. Hit Contracting is 80 years old. Davis Construction is 60 years old. We're 30 years old. We're the child. It's a very long game, and people aren't going to push millions of dollars into your hands unless you have a track record. So every single experience has to build on itself so that you get the next project and the next project, and where you build loyalty. Uh-oh, Kyle.
You spoke about your board work, and obviously, there's a need for women on boards, and I was just curious about that path. When did you pick and decide to be on a board, and then, as you look at board opportunities today, how do you approach that?
18 years ago, a woman I knew through the International Women's Forum, the Washington chapter of the International Women's Forum. So you get this sense that I'm a joiner. That's how I built a network. The Greater Washington Board of Trade, the Federal City Council, CREW, Commercial Real Estate Women. I joined all those organizations. And an organization that I joined was the International Women's Forum. And a woman named Barbara Franklin became my friend. I actually was the first president of the Washington chapter. And I always thought that if people would see me in a leadership position, that they'd be more comfortable recommending me as a leader or as a contractor. And she said that she was going off the board of Watson Wyatt, and she was hell-bent on putting another woman in there. And she had just watched me be the president of the IWF, and would I meet the CEO? So it wasn't actually in my game book. I didn't even think about 20 years ago about being on corporate boards or being on public company boards. I was so used to being in the not-for-profit world or the industry association world. Those were the worlds I played in. And I was perfectly happy in that. I was just amazed that anyone wanted to actually pay me for, things I was doing, giving away in the community. And I took that position, and later, many years later, was honored by the Business Journal for Board Member of the Year with 10 other people. And with 11 other people, there were 12 of us that the Business Journal honored. There was one black woman, me, and 10 white guys. And I remember going back to my table and saying to my husband, this just isn't right. So I took money, I took stock that I had earned as a Watson Wyatt director, and started a program at GW called On the Board to teach other women how to get on boards. And that program lasted for 2 years. It was very successful, but then the dean of the business school left, and the head of IWF retired, and I had no posse. So my program now is at Harvard Business School, and it's called Women on Boards. Last year, 190 women from 14 countries came to Harvard Business School to the program that was just in my little pea head. So my charge to you is, no matter where you sit, you can be influential, because influence is really, really powerful. Can you imagine nobody else in the world thought to take to Harvard Business School something about a very timely topic? I mean, it is Harvard Business School, right? So now I'm too old to sit on boards anymore. And what my give back is to help other people do that. But it wasn't in my game book to sit on boards. It's now considered, the last mile. If you're going to be a seasoned business person, you have to have sat on a public company board. And I see why, because it's very challenging. It's interesting stuff.
Well, go ahead.
Hi, Linda.
Hi, Lyles. Oh dear. Truth serum.
I like the disease to please thing, but candidly, I think it's much deeper than that. You and I once had a conversation about servant leadership.
Yes, we did.
Not that conversation, but talk a little bit about that, because I think that's really been part and parcel of your life going forward in terms of the whole concept of servant leadership.
So Lyles, if you'll recall, we were on a plane to Colorado to a Leadership Washington conference, and you invited me to try Rocky Mountain oysters, and I didn't know what that was. I think it's, well, I didn't know what it was. And, you know, I fell in love with you then, that you could convince me to do something like that. But on the way home, you gave me an orange book, and I still have it in my file, and it's called Servant Leadership. And you talked to me about what that meant. And I was just starting RAND at the time. So the lore in my company is, if Linda has to vacuum on Sunday night at your job site, your job is in jeopardy. I would vacuum. My husband would haul trash. We would do anything we could to make sure that on Monday morning when that client moved in, we were ready to go. And I enlisted my kids, my husband, anybody I could. And servant leadership is about the power of giving and the power of empathy. And I have watched that in so many people. I've watched every other, as you would imagine, I did my homework. I watched what everyone else had said to you all in this series. And every one of them talked about giving back, talked about being the bigger person. I know all of them, and they all work harder than anyone else in their company. I can get any number of those people. Ken Samet's my neighbor. I email him and get an email back that day because he cares about his connection to people. So I was very impressed with the theme of many of the people you have interviewed so far, not talking about the I did this and I did that, but talking about pulling out the best in other people and how that elevates each one of you, and that's servant leadership.
That's great. Any question? Oh.
Hi, you discussed, you discussed your mentors and people that are connected that help you get ahead. I'm wondering, who are the unsung heroes that helped you with your family, let you travel to Colorado or do the weekends finishing things up? Who are the other support network that you had in the community that let you be successful?
So, I have all different kinds of support networks in my personal life, and some of them are paid and some of them are unpaid. I met my husband just as I was starting RAND construction. We dated for 3 years before we got married, and every one of you who knows him will say that he was my #1 support network. And who, as it turns out, who you marry is really important. Because if you're ambitious, you have to be a team. You have to really be not just in love, but you have to be a partnership. And every night we would have to figure out who was going to take which child to which this, to which that, to, we were just really a team. And I see in my own company, I see people who struggle with that, whose spouse, either way, has certain expectations that cannot be met if you have to be out 3 nights a week at industry associations, or you have to entertain, or you have to have the demands of a job. And in my case, it's, construction it used to start at 6:30 in the morning. Now many of our job sites start at 4:30 in the morning. And so somebody has to get up in the middle of the night, and that means a child still has to get to school. It really is all about teamwork and about partnering. And I chose that man not only because I loved him, but because I knew he would be my partner.
Pinky Mayfield, and I think that there was a question in the back. I'm sorry. I think there was a question in the back that I really did want to get a little deeper on. What would you tell your 20-year-old self?
The way I would answer that would be when more in the yesteryear than today, but still today, when I go into a woman's office and say, can I see you for a minute in my office? First thing out of her mouth, what did I do wrong? If I go into a man's office and say, can I see you in my office for a minute? He goes, yeah, what do you need? How can I help you? So, all the women are laughing. You understand? So I would tell myself that it's okay to be scared, and it's okay to be angry. You just have to be careful about it. And there were many times that I was very angry, and I probably didn't handle those situations the way I do. I'm pretty mellow now, but when I was really fighting for my company and my children, there were probably times that I was more strident than I needed to be.
One more question?
Last question.
Hi, thanks again for sharing your story. It's been really inspirational. You mentioned how you were suffering from the disease to please in your earlier years. I was wondering to what extent you still find yourself feeling those emotions at times, and if so, how you overcome them, or if you don't anymore, how you were able to get to that point.
So I still have the disease to please, but I turn it to my best advantage. There is nothing greater for me than after we build out a client's offices that I go to what I call the Chardonnay party, and somebody says, we couldn't have done it without you. Thank you so much. You made this really treacherous experience a really good one. And that just fills me up for the next day. That just fills up my tank for the next day. So I just use it to a good advantage now, instead of to the bad advantage that I don't let bad people define who I am. I define who I am.
Linda, thank you so much for
Linda, thank you so much. Yeah, what a remarkable story. Steve Harlan, you have to stand up. Stand up, Steve. One of our founders, a visionary for the region.
Thank you, Linda, for your kind words. But it's important for you to really listen to what she says. She has been the president or the chairman of every organization she's ever been in. So her father's comment of if it's good enough, it's not good enough. She has been selected the leader. She was the top corporate board member in the United States. Picked up. She was chairman of the Federal Reserve of Richmond. She's been chairman of every organization. And so she has set, you heard the details how in her planning on Sundays and all, but it really works if you do that. That's my only underscore. And she's a delight. Our families, her husband and our son are partners in real estate investments. Our daughter hosted Ashley when she was singing opera in Cleveland. Our daughter lives in Cleveland. Stayed with our daughter for 6 weeks, and they're good pals. And in fact, she's coming to town, and we're having dinner next week. So it's family together. And thank you for being you.
Steve, thank you very much.